to the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I'm so pleased to have a great turnout for what I anticipate to be a really informative event this evening. I'm Christina Ewing. I am the Faculty Director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy here at the Humphrey School. The Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy is the oldest center of its kind, established in 1985 and dedicated to a combination of research, teaching, and outreach on specific issues of gender and public policy. So this event fits into our outreach, where what we try to do through events like these is raise awareness about contemporary issues of important public policy that affect women and gender, and to start community conversations about these kinds of issues. So that's what we hope to do tonight. Let me go back in time a little bit to last March, when our center held an event about the Ni Una Menos movement. Some of you may have heard about this. That is translated into English. It means not one less. And it was focused on the momentous movement that has been taking place in Latin America over the past 2 years, in which activists have been bringing out literally hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets to protest rising rates of femicide in many Latin American countries. And many of those, we brought in 2 activists to talk about that movement last March, and they talked about the social media outreach that they did to make those movements happen. And at that time, I had no idea that about 6 months later, we would be witnessing a movement of our own of a very similar nature here in the United States. By now, all of us in the room are familiar with the Me Too movement that was launched in October of last year, initiated as a broad movement, public movement, by women in Hollywood speaking out about sexual harassment that they found on the job. But soon we were to see stories related to women of all walks of life, whether in the Minnesota State House, in a Chicago Ford factory, or most recently, what we saw in the sentencing of the U.S. gymnastics athletic doctor, Larry Nassar, yesterday. So we've seen a string of events that has kept momentum moving in relationship to gender and violence at all different levels across the United States, really a reinvigoration of violence against women's movement here. So we're at a cultural turning point where it's been incredibly important to hear the brave voices of women who have been victims of violence, either as girls or as women. And we have seen some accountability, in particular with the sentencing that occurred of Dr. Nassar. And those are good things. But what do we do to create a world in which the kinds of violence that we've been hearing about since October doesn't happen in the first place? How do we create a world in which there is prevention of violence, in particular violence of men against women and girls? And so that's why our center brought together the men that you will hear today to talk about the relationships between changing cultures of masculinity and preventing gender-based violence. And before you ask, why is it that you have an all-male panel? The reason we have an all-male panel for this is precisely because on this issue that affects women and girls so deeply, they should not be the ones to shoulder all of the responsibility for making change, especially change that comes from dynamics that most often stem from men and masculinities together. So that's why we have 3 men who have been leading efforts to stand up, to call out, to develop practices and teaching to try to address issues of gender inequities among men and boys in partnership with women and girls. So I'm going to take about 2 more minutes to provide some brief introductions to our 3 speakers. I'll do them in order, the order in which they will speak, and then we'll move on to 3 presentations of each, followed of about 15 minutes each, followed by what I hope will be a robust dialogue of questions and answers. First, we will have Brian Heilman, who is a senior research officer of Promundo. Promundo is a global organization that's involved in a variety of fronts to transform harmful gender norms by engaging men and boys in partnership with women and girls to change cultures that cause gender inequities. Brian's been integral in Promundo's research arm, which does some groundbreaking surveys on perceptions of masculinity worldwide, and he's going to provide some of that data for us today. And he's also developed some on-the-ground responses in different countries around the world to the kinds of findings that they have encountered in that research. Second, we'll hear from Pheng Thao, who is the statewide coordinator of the Minnesota Men and Masculine Folks Network. This is a collaborative of many community organizations and individuals that work on these issues. Pheng is also founder and director of Man Forward, which is a Twin Cities organization that works towards developing new practices of brotherhood among men and boys and masculinities to end gender violence and promote gender equity. He's also founded a domestic violence monuments program called Zingi, which I probably pronounced wrong, but maybe he'll correct me later in the program. And finally, we'll hear from Ed Heisler. Ed Heisler is Executive Director of Men as Peacemakers that's based in Duluth. This is a nonprofit that focuses on addressing the root causes of violence against women and children, And he has developed sexual and domestic violence prevention programming that mobilizes and engages men to reduce violence against and exploitation of women and girls. So join me in welcoming our 3 speakers tonight, and we'll first hear from Brian.
Okay, is this working?
Yes.
Great. Okay, what an honor to be here, really, and to look around the room and see a very full room and so many friendly faces, and I recognize certainly some experts and advocates and activists from the local community working to prevent and respond to men's violence against women, and I really look forward to the conversation that we'll be able to have in a little bit. My responsibility, and thank you, Christina, and thank you to the Center for the opportunity, I think my responsibility for the first presentation is to ground us a little bit in some of the concepts that we're going to be discussing throughout the day, and specifically this idea of masculinities. So I thought maybe the best way to start this was with even a little bit of an interactive thought exercise. And the thing that I want everyone in the room to do, just take a second and think of the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the phrase, be a man. When you think of the concept of be a real man, or man up, or, the cruder formulation sometimes, grow a pair. Just think of what that means. Probably it means things like this. In order to be a man, according to this societal singular path, you can't show vulnerable emotions. You must be powerful. You must defend yourself. You must be competitive. No weakness at all times. And these other ideas that come from lots of practice in doing this activity with high schoolers and college kids and other people. And now, in a world where this is the singular script of masculinity, if you fail to live up to this whole array of rules, and it's all but impossible to meet all of these rules, then what might you be called, or what messages might you hear when you fall short? Maybe you're called a pussy, fag. These are the kind of messages and the kind of insults that we use to keep guys inside and on this narrow path of a singular masculinity. So this is kind of what we mean, and I'm sorry if this is open as a review for certain people in the room, but this is what we're talking about when we're talking about masculinity. We're not talking about body parts. We're talking about social messages about what it really means to be a man that rarely have anything to do with body parts. And I think what I want to do over the next 15 minutes is try to connect subscribing and believing in the singular restrictive path of masculinity connected to a lot of very harmful outcomes in society primarily in today's conversation, sexual violence and harassment, physical violence against intimate partners, but we can also see a lot of other links. In this activity, those of you who've done this 100 times know it's the man box. So I'm going to be referring to the man box throughout the rest of the presentation as a kind of shorthand for this restrictive singular masculinity. Now, as a stodgy quantitative researcher, okay, a question.
Sorry to interrupt, just back here, I'm not positive your mic is working.
Oh boy. Look at that, it's on off.
Hello. Is this better? Okay. Thank you. Everyone can hear me better, I presume. Anyways, what I was saying, as a stodgy quantitative researcher in my day job, it's my responsibility to try to take that stew of man box messages and put it into a survey in a way that makes sense and allows men to share with us the extent to which they really agree with those kind of ideas. I know this is a lot to cover on a slide, but these are 4 out of the 7 domains, you'll see the other 3, that we use in a lot of our quantitative research at Promundo. Being a man means self-sufficiency, it means acting tough, it means your physical appearance and attractiveness, it means agreeing with rigid roles within the household. And you can see under each theme there are a few different sentences, and these sentences reflect kind of one component of that singular rigid path of masculinity. And in the survey, then, we asked the respondents to tell us how much they agree with that idea. So, a guy who doesn't fight back when others push him around is weak. This kind of thing. A husband shouldn't have to do household chores. Then we get to the domains that are a little more relevant to today's conversation. Of course, a real man needs to be heterosexual. Okay? I don't believe that, but that's part of the singular path I'm talking about. So we have statements like, a gay guy isn't a real man. We get to the middle one, and there's a lot about this singular path of masculinity that has to do with approaching sexual relationships as conquest, as having as many sexual partners as you can. So we have statements like, a real man would never say no to sex. A real man should have as many sexual partners as he can. And look, I recognize these are messy concepts. You can't just squash them into numbers perfectly, but this is the nature of survey research, and when we have massive sample sizes, it still tells us something interesting. So I have an opportunity to apply this kind of a tool all around the world, and also in the US, and so I'm going to start globally, move to the US context, and just provide in each of those 2 locations one example where the way that men believe, the extent to which men believe in that singular restrictive idea of what masculinity means links with their perpetration of violence. So, and this is something I can talk all about afterward, outside if you're interested, but for almost 10 years now I've been involved in something called the International Men and Gender Equality Survey. It's a household survey that's taking place in various forms in 36 countries now, with 50,000 interviews, including men and women. Everywhere we carry out this study, which is images for shorthand, we have interviews with men and with women alike, and it's almost always the first time in that country where we've got a survey on a wide range of health outcomes, of health seeking, drug and alcohol use, childhood experiences, gender norms within either your childhood home or your current relationship, and of course various kinds of perpetration and experience of violence. And we're able to link that with the way that the respondents answer related to their feelings about masculinity and about gender equality. So, just to kind of ground us in the concept we're talking about, on the world stage I'm going to be showing data about reported rates of using physical violence at any point against an intimate partner. Your current wife, current girlfriend, or prior girlfriend. Now, just imagine, on a global level, what would you think is the percentage prevalence of men who tell us in these surveys that they have ever used any form of physical violence against an intimate partner? If you had to guess a number, this is men telling us. This is an easy one. Think of a number in your head, and then I'm going to show you the real number. You're going to get it right. Okay, 18 to 65%. So if you're anywhere in that range, you're doing okay. And why is it such a wide range? Well, because each country has its own number, and the country with the lowest measured prevalence we've got is 18 all the way up to 65%. Now, this is men reporting to us that they've used some form of physical violence against an intimate partner in their lives. And there's every reason in which this is underreported. I mean, of course, men have every reason not to admit that they've done this. So you have to understand these figures as an absolute minimum floor, like unrealistically low percentage of that dynamic. When we look at the rates of women who are reporting, and reporting in this case means just answering the survey, not reporting to police or something. When we look at women's answers, the percentages are higher. When we add in the amount of emotional abuse that men tell us that they perpetrate or women tell us they experience, financial abusive behaviors, controlling and coercive behaviors, such as, he tells her what she can wear or not wear. He tells her when she can leave the house or not. He wants to know who she's around all the time. And of course, sexual violence occurs within intimate relationships also. When we add any of those factors in, of course, the numbers go up. So that's just the prevalence we're talking about. And if I had to guess, I would say probably a lot of you in the room aren't totally shocked by these numbers. If you dig into this information at all, you're likely to see the figures of 1 in 3 women or more who at some point in their lives experience physical or sexual violence. And it's just interesting to note that on the one hand, and it's really a shortcoming of quantitative data, that on the one hand, I think we all have kind of encountered this number of a massive prevalence of violence against women, 1 in 3 or more women around the world, but at the same time, somehow our society is like shocked and surprised when there's a case of violence of someone prominent in the news. So that's kind of something to carry as well. Now, this is the wonkiest quantitative slide that I've got for anybody here. Is any quantitative researchers in the house who are excited to see odds ratios? Okay, a few. So you 4 people can look at the left side of the screen, and the rest of y'all can look here. What we're looking at is a relationship between the extent to which men tell us that they believe in that rigid, restrictive masculinity, and their likelihood of telling us that they've ever used violence, physical violence against their wife or former partner. And what we see is that for every incremental step compared to other men in their country, for every step toward more equitable views about gender and masculinity, we see a 14% to a 37% lower odds of perpetrating violence. It's a standard deviation. So as you meaningfully have more equitable ideas about what masculinity should mean, we see a tremendous link in 6 out of these 8 countries with a lower likelihood of using violence. Oops, skipped one. Now, these numbers aren't just a test of those 2 things on their own. We're weighing also into this equation age, education, marital status, all of these other important factors. And it's not to say that gender attitudes are the only driver of men's use of violence against their partner. These things matter as well, but it's to say that even when we consider any difference that could be explained by all these other factors, we see tremendous links. So it matters what you think about masculinity in terms of your likelihood of using violence in a relationship. And that makes all the sense in the world. If you believe that as a man you have a right to control your partner's movements, if you believe as a man that you have to use physical violence to solve problems, we see that link strongly. Now, what does this look like in the US? Last year, my colleagues and I led a study among men aged 18 to 30 in 3 countries, the United Kingdom, the US, and Mexico, using a survey as well as focus group discussions, and we'll see a little bit of the qualitative information as well here. And this was actually the quote that I used to title the presentation. This participant in a discussion says, "How does society let men act?" And as I looked at that question more, even building these slides, I thought, that's even deeper than he thought. Because it kind of moves in 2 directions. On the one hand, I think we have a society that lets men do horrible things and consider it pretty normal. But on the other hand, we simultaneously see that restrictive man-box masculinity that makes it a pretty narrow amount of things that a man can do and be identified as a real man. So that's one of a few different ideas that we need to be able to hold simultaneously, I think. That we have ideas about what a real man needs to be, those are very violent and very entitled over women's bodies. And that maybe there's a lot that's bad about that. That's definitely for women, no question. But maybe there's something that's bad about that for men as well. And that is maybe a doorway into some of these solutions. Okay, so what do our young men peers in the United States think about some of these man box rules? There's a lot of numbers on the slide. I'm going to have to move quickly so we can have an open discussion. But if you look, for instance, at these bottom couple, a real man should have as many sexual partners as he can. 1 in 4, 26% of men in the US tell us on a survey they agree with that. If a guy has a girlfriend or wife, he deserves to know where she is at all times, almost half. I agree with this controlling kind of behavior. I'll definitely share this presentation with anybody who wants to see it. So, at the global level, we looked at physical violence against intimate partners. In the US, I wanted to look at sexual harassment. We were talking quite a lot about that, and Christina framed the conversation that way. So what percentage of men aged 18 to 30 told us that they had made sexual comments to a woman or girl they didn't know just in the last month? Just in the last month before the survey. 29% of men in our survey told us this. What does that mean? 1 in 3 almost men tell us just within a month that this had happened. And so this helps us kind of explode the mainstream narrative of who a perpetrator of sexual harassment or sexual violence is. Certainly, it's a lot of men in high power positions in Hollywood, in politics, in business positions. But we have 1 in 3 guys aged 18 to 30 all around the country also telling us that they have done this. So we need to think a little more broadly. And I'm here again to make the link between restrictive masculinity and the perpetration of that violence. What we did here is break up the sort of levels of agreement with that rigid man box into 5 groups, all the way from those who are completely rejecting the whole man box, all the way up to those who are most agreeing. And this is how strong the link is. 29% of all of the men in the survey, but among the 1/5 of men who most strongly agree with that rigid man box masculinity and those rules that I showed in the earlier slides, in the US, 71% of those guys reported that they had perpetrated sexual harassment within a month. So, now to bring it around to, to set us up for the conversations to come, if this is the shape of the issue, the shape of the problem globally, we see that the extent to which one agrees with this rigid definition of masculinity links with perpetration of physical violence against a partner, links with perpetration of sexual harassment in public. I don't have time to go into it, but I can show you all the research and share materials later about those same agreements with a rigid masculinity link with all of these things. Coercive and controlling relationship behavior, all sorts of violence. But also for that guy, depressive symptoms, suicidal thoughts, risky driving. It's a component root cause to all of these negatives in society. So if that's the shape of the problem, that this rigid masculinity drives so many negative health outcomes, then I think we start to see the way towards some of the solutions. Obviously, that is what we need to be addressing. And we've luckily got some activists and educators in the room who are going to show us how they're doing that locally. Moving very quickly through some ideas of what this solution might look like, and then ceding the floor. Like I said, the man box is bad for pretty much everyone. Not everyone. There's certain very empowered men who benefit from that rigid ordering of society, obviously, but there are ways in which it's restrictive to men's identities, and that could be a way in building more allies. Importantly, we all have a role to play in eliminating these messages. I mean, we see the messages in media, we hear our friends say things, we encounter the idea of manning up or whatever around us in the world, and we can intervene in those cases. This has to start from the earliest ages. It can't, that's what we're talking about when it comes to prevention. It's not just about a prominent case of violence happens and how do we respond to that, but it's what about
building skills of critical deconstruction of masculinities into our school curricula. Why not? It's such a tremendous issue. I think it also bears repeating over and over, particularly as we're up here as a bunch of men dominating the conversation. We have to center the voices and experiences and preferences of women and survivors of violence as we do this work. I hope we'll do that in the conversation today. And that doesn't mean just demanding that survivors of violence bear their most horrible experiences and let society ogle them in order to move the movement forward. What it means is that guys have a tendency to just take over stuff when we get involved, and we can't do that in this space. And the last couple ideas, just, it's complicated. It is. Not all men are the same. We have to reckon with the fact that transgender women, men of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, different wealth backgrounds, experience that man box differently, and we have to kind of carry all of those complexities as we do this work, and not presume that it looks identical for everybody. But even as it's complicated, it's actually kind of simple at the same time, that this is bullshit that has a lot of horrible outcomes across society, and it's not that crazy to think that we could be moving more toward a more open man box. Smash the box altogether, but let everyone identify with these kind of attitudes, to hear these kind of messages in society when they live that way, and to have the kind of outcomes that will move toward preventing violence and move toward a more equal and peaceful society. And I went a couple minutes over, and I feel bad about that, but thank you so much for your kind attention, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, so can everybody hear me? I think between Ed and I, we had to flip a coin and see who was going to present the stats on what violence looks like in the state of Minnesota. And so I was the one that got the one to do this part. So I'm going to present a lot of numbers to all of you. And I'm not good with numbers either. That's why I do this work. Otherwise, I would have been a math teacher at some point in my life. And so just bear with me if these numbers bore you in some ways. But I think what it also shows is that it shows us how important it is for actually men and masculine identities to actually get involved and get on board with actually ending gender-based violence. And so that's the term that I'm going to use, is gender-based violence, in this discussion that I'm going to talk about here. I'm starting off with the Femicide Report, 2016 Femicide Report from the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women. Actually, the one for 2017 will come out tomorrow. And every year, Tuesday. Oh, okay. Sorry, my colleagues corrected me. But it's a good report to read because it shows us how many folks have actually been murdered. And what this tells us is this is the most extreme form of that violence, right? Because we have to think about violence, what Brian was talking about, on a spectrum, and the name calling all of that being on one end, and murder being on the other end of that spectrum. And so this is what it looked like in 2016. We had about 18 women who were murdered, and 60,000 individuals who went and got services. And it's roughly about, I think from reading the reports over the years, it's roughly around 60,000 people who actually annually access services in the state of Minnesota because of domestic violence. The other part of it is, I think we often forget that sometimes when the women are murdered, who takes care of the kids, right? Because the kids get left alone and by themselves without a parent. And so in this case, we had 14 minor children who were left without a mother or a parent in any case. I remembered years ago as a domestic violence advocate working out in Brooklyn Center, and it was a lone case, and the woman had been murdered, and her body was found by her oldest son, and he wasn't found until like 2 days after, and when he was found, he hung himself because he committed suicide. He hung himself in the park, and these two kids who went walking in the park found him. And what happened in that case was there was 8 kids in that case. The oldest was, I think 20 something, and the youngest was like 4 years old. And who did they go and stay with? They all went and stayed with her, meaning the victim's brother. And he, the brother, had his own kids. I think he had like 5 kids too. And so it was like, now you're putting the burden on somebody else to take care of the kids, right? So I think we often forget that in murder, domestic homicides, and suicides, where both parents are not there anymore, the kids are often left without parents. Or they get divvied up, meaning divided up, and placed into foster care in separate homes. So out of these 18 murder cases of women, the perpetrators had documented criminal and or civil legal history of domestic violence. Three of those cases had a history of domestic violence against the person that they killed. And 7 of those cases, the offender had been on supervision for qualified domestic violence related offense, 5 years, meaning that they were there for, sometimes what they do in prosecuting the cases, they'll charge it as a domestic violence, but then sometimes they'll plead it down to like a disorderly conduct. So that's, I think, my understanding of it, and my colleagues from MCBW who are here could correct me on that too. So this is what we saw for those cases. 50%, I think the number that I want to show there is firearm, is still the number one choice of weapon in terms of killing the person. The offender choosing to kill somebody, 50% is still, and I think that that's on average, yearly, that's what they see in the reports that we've seen. The other point is regulation. They did a report from 1986 to 2015, I believe, or 2005 around strangulation, and so that's why there's a law in the state of Minnesota around strangulation as well, because that's the other way in which perpetrators often kill their victims. So now we're going to move to, so I'm going to cover domestic violence, I'm covering sexual violence, and then I'll cover commercial sexual exploitation, and then we'll look at violence towards LGBTQ folks as well, and what those numbers look like. So this is what we see in terms of the data for those women and girls who've been impacted by sexual assault in the state of Minnesota. In this survey, I forgot where it was from, but they said that 12% of the girls reported that once they graduated high school, they've somehow experienced sexual assault. When they finished college, 29% of them have experienced sexual assault. And in their midlife, 33% of them have actually experienced sexual assault. And all of this is relevant to that in the state of Minnesota. This is off of the 2015 legislative report by the Minnesota Department of Health. This is the numbers. Every year, what they do is the Minnesota Student Survey, they do a yearly report around asking students their health. And then within the Department of Health, there is the Injury and Violence Prevention Unit. And so they'll ask questions around sexual violence as well. And so these are the numbers that are saying there. And what this tells us is that it starts at a really young age, right? Because we're looking at 11th graders here. We're not even talking about college, we're not even talking about adults, but we're looking at high schoolers. And it even starts younger than that. And I think about like how young boys are exposed to pornography at a much younger age. And these days, with them being on iPads and cell phones and things like that, they can accidentally bump into it very easily, right? So though these are just numbers that are being reported through the survey only, but we know that the numbers are actually higher than this because there's many people who actually don't report as well, or who probably didn't take the survey. I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is in 2012, they said that 39 rapes per 100,000 people. And I think that that was significant because of the fact that we live in the Twin Cities and we have, if you think about that, that's like 2-3 times that amount, right? And then there was a study in obviously North Minneapolis that found that African American folks had traded sex for shelter, food, and something else of value in the last 5 years, and that 50% of them had first traded for sex as a minor at the average age of 13 in 2010. So we're going to look at commercial sexual exploitation, and I think the point here is understanding that Minnesota is a hotbed for child's commercial sexual exploitation. And I think that that's alarming, so that is really important for all of us in this room to actually take note of that. And a lot of work has been done, I think, and a lot of research has been done in the state of Minnesota by the University of Minnesota in conjunction with the Women's Foundation to really give us these numbers and these data on what commercial sexual exploitation looks like in the state of Minnesota, particularly with the girls and women who are actually being trafficked in it. I wanted to say that most of the buyers, I think that this is the highlight point in their executive summary from Minnesota Girls Are Not For Sale in terms of mapping the demand, the executive summary from the Women's Foundation, saying that sex buyers are predominantly middle-aged white married men from across the whole state of Minnesota, which is representative of Minnesota's general population, which is really ironic because most of the people who are actually trafficked, minors, are actually women and girls of color. So there's an irony there, I think maybe perhaps, but it takes a different paradigm shift for us to really think about who the buyers are and who the people who are being trafficked really are as well. I wanted to say here that most of the time people do it during their lunch hours and they're actually traveling somewhere else, right, during their commute. And so it's important to know that they're not actually doing it in their town or their city, but they're actually going somewhere else. And this is actually pretty true. In my work with people who've committed sex offenses, they'll do it online, they'll hook up, and then they'll drive actually 30 to 60 miles somewhere else. And what eventually will happen is, if it's a sting, what will happen is that they'll be caught halfway to where they're going to do the meetup at. This is how buyers actually solicit for and connect to being able to hook up with minor women and girls who are being trafficked. And so we're going to look at some numbers with regards to LGBTQ folks. I think this is important because in this discussion, when we look at gender-based violence, we're really looking at the broad definition of what gender is. And we have to include, and we must include, LGBTQ-identified folks in this discussion when we're wanting to think about like preventing violence and ending violence. Because part of masculinity is in that definition of gender as well, and that also impacts LGBTQ folks as well. And many of the violence that LGBTQ folks also face with regards to homophobia and transphobia and heterosexism all stem from our ideas of what men should be and women should be as well, right, in our rigid thinking. I think what I want to highlight here is that this is a national survey, so Minnesota is not included in this slide and the next slide of anti-violence programs. But this is a coalition and they do a yearly report on what the rate of violence looks like for LGBTQ folks in the community. Now, this is a very specific one to intimate partner violence and what it looks like across the state of across the country. I wanted to say that 60% of the folks who were involved in these homicides, of these 15 homicides, were people of color, and 60% of the victims who were killed in these homicides were cisgender men. And this is what the hate crime stats look like. And most of it here is because of heterosexism and anti-gay violence. So, and again, a lot of these cases, 1,000 cases that were reviewed across the board from 12 programs across the country, and again, Minnesota is not included in this, is that 61% of them are people of color who are LGBTQ identified who are experiencing the violence. And so I think that really shows us like the intersections between race and gender, and we have to really think about how those identities actually intersect. So when you're a person of color, you're not only experiencing racism, but you're also experiencing the sexism, the homophobia that comes along with it if you're identifying in the LGBT community. And again, this is the gender identity. Most of the people who reported are cisgender men. And I think the report said that what the report shared was that because cisgender men were able to access the resources more readily, more available, that's why you see a higher number in there. And that's that. And then so Ed's going to talk about the strategy that men as peacemakers use, and then I'll come back and talk about man forward strategy.
All right, well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see so many people here. As it was said, I'm the co-executive director with Sarah Curtis at Men as Peacemakers. We're based in Duluth, Minnesota, if you haven't heard of us before. And we have the unique privilege of being able to really focus on prevention and engaging men with people of all gender identities in unique ways of trying to think about how you create the conditions for gender equity to thrive and try to move the dial on preventing violence against women and children. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we approach that, and it's really well paired with what Pheng is going to talk about because, Men as Peacemakers is a unique organization, but it's a mainstream organization. And so what we do is we try to come up with strategies in ways that you can attract community into an opportunity to get involved in making a positive impact into something that they care about. So we're basically trying to pull people in and create community out of the broad pool that exists in our community, which is different than the leadership that we see from folks who come from culturally specific communities or gender specific communities. Oftentimes that leadership, that's the place where you see the most tuned in sort of approaches to what's needed in communities that might be increasingly vulnerable, or approaches that might work in specific parts of a community or with specific cultural backgrounds, things like that. So our approaches are designed to have a broad impact. And the first thing that I'd say about how we approach this is that we definitely focus in on what the harm is that's caused, and then what can be done about it. And you've heard Brian and you've heard Pheng talk about the statistics and how horrifying they are. Just at the platform, sort of knowing that 1 in 3 of the girls that we have born into our communities, we can expect that if the conditions remain the same, that they're going to experience some form of sexual or domestic violence. It's a pretty horrifying reality that we're creating through young people who are born into our communities. And so one of the things that we really want to be clear about is the fact that violence is really functional, purposeful behavior. It doesn't happen because we're creating people who are outside of the norm, and that's creating a whole bunch of violence. It doesn't happen because there's a disproportionate number of monsters being born these days. That's not what's going on. What's going on is that this violence happens within a context of normality, and that normality is male dominance. And you've heard that being talked about by both Pheng and Brian. And so when we look at whether it's sexual violence or whether it's domestic violence, what we know is that there's an intention that goes into it. In sexual violence, the intention is to get what you want no matter what. In domestic violence, it can be a whole variety of things, usually related to getting what you want, making her stop talk, getting control of the finances, getting sex when you want, those kinds of things. And the intentions are pretty clear when you talk to folks who are perpetrating this stuff. And in order to get what folks are looking for, there's a series of actions that get taken to get what they want. And that can be anything from feeding a person alcohol, setting them up, getting them isolated from a group of people so that you can take advantage of them sexually. It can be a set of actions that systematically degrade, tear down, and make a person fearful for their life so that you get to do what you want to do. And the piece that I think we're really talking about here is the beliefs that make it okay. So when you have conversations with folks who have used violence, there's always a justification for why it was okay for them to do what they wanted. She was asking for it is one that we hear a lot about, right? Also, things like, she made me so angry, she never respects me, she's spending all the money, right? She doesn't listen. Those sorts of things. They represent beliefs that are related to the man box that Brian is talking about, right? If you believe that men are supposed to have access to women sexually all the time, if you believe that that men aren't supposed to show weakness or vulnerability, that men are supposed to be in charge and in control, those are beliefs about your gender that are going to feed right into beliefs that justify male dominance and harming folks. And so when we look at our work, what we want to do is we want to create conditions where beliefs and values that surround equality, beliefs and values that promote the interconnected well-being of people, beliefs and values that talk about, men being essentially good. Nobody's born destined to be a perpetrator, right? That's not what's going on with men. But instead that what we have when we have our young boys born into the world is we have folks who have all the potential to do great things for other people. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is what environment are we actually creating for them that's creating the conditions where so many of them are identifying so strongly with the man box that Brian's talking about. And so many of them are in a place where they're feeling justified in using violence and causing harm. And so our strategies, they include a couple of different things. One is we don't shy away from talking about what the violence is, what the responsibility is, and the harm that it causes. Second part of our strategy is that we do focus on the potential and the potential that men have, the positive potential. We focus on the fact that the vast majority of men are actually men who want good things for their community. And the question is, have we been stepping into our potential in a good enough way, in a big enough way, in order to make that happen, especially when we talk about issues like sexual and domestic violence. And the third thing that we do is we recognize that this is in a community context. It's a different way than in culturally specific or gender-specific community-based work. But what we know is that the solution doesn't necessarily reside in getting a large group of men standing together and talking about solutions. It's not only about getting men together to talk about men, that in fact we live our lives and we live in our communities with all sorts of people of different genders, different background, different racial background, et cetera, et cetera. And so the goal is to get folks coming together in ways where they can build community and work together in order to shift environments that help prevent the harm. So a couple of ways that we do this. There's different layers of how you look at prevention and male engagement. And one that is really common, this would be a form of it, is raising awareness, right? Just putting messages out there into the world that contradict the man box, the narratives about men being dominant, that call people to a different set of actions. Those can be really effective. They change conversations, right? And that's a big part of what we do. We like to try to go a step further and tie it to actual organizational practice changes, things that actually change the way that people experience their workplace environments, their institutional environments, things like that. And so this project, which is called the Impact Project, really focuses on athletics and the power that athletics has to shape the way that young people think about themselves, their identities, their relationships to other people. And what we do with this is we actually are focusing not so much on the athletes, although Men as Peacemakers does work doing presentations to older athletes. What we focus on is coaches of youth athletic organizations. And we want to think systematically about how you actually get those folks who are largely volunteers, and a heavy majority of them are men, into a situation where it's normal for them to be getting information about how to promote gender equity, how to role model what healthy masculinity looks like, and how to watch out for warning signs for abuse and give messages about healthy relationships and things like that. So the Impact program has created everything from a collaborative online training module that has been mandated for all of the coaches in the state of Minnesota, high school coaches in that case, to awareness raising guides that help give pointers on how you can shape a team environment that promotes gender equity. So our most recent thing that we completed was an implementation manual that's actually meant for the administrators of those organizations. And it takes them step by step through, here's how you write the letter to the parents. Here's what your coaching packet would look like. Here's how you take the manual that you give to your volunteer coaches and you insert things about your expectations around gender equity and violence prevention and things like that. And we have a systematic way for them to utilize those things. Now, this one doesn't actually create a whole lot of community in and of itself. It's not bringing people together who are going to work together to solve problems that they have in common. What it does is it sort of moves the dial on what becomes normal in that mainstreamed environment. And we're inserting prevention and we're inserting healthy masculinity and prevention messages into the practices of those coaches. So we actually like to say we're trying to change job descriptions of coaches, particularly athletic coaches. Another example of work that we do is a program called our Best Party Model. The way that it's generally called by students who are in it is the Party Revolution. And this is the idea. This happens generally on college campuses. We also do work with bars and music festivals in Duluth. But the idea was we were doing a lot of work on campuses, trying to talk about prevention, trying to get men engaged, do that kind of stuff. And when we tried to get to the point where we were getting students to take action and see how they could have a broader impact on their environment, like in a public health approach sort of way, what we found was that we were having trouble making it relevant to the lives that they saw on campuses. And so in Duluth, we started talking with students about, like, what environments do you really feel like you have the power to shape? What do you really care about, something that you feel like you have a lot of ownership over? And what we heard was parties. Parties are a place where we connect with one another. Parties are a place where we let off a bunch of steam. It's one of the only places that students actually have complete control over the environment that they shape. And so we created a project. At first it was a lot of going around with clipboards and taking notes and getting information about what was comfortable and what was uncomfortable. But now we've got an eight-week program that students go through. Some of them are mandated, and some of them go through it just because they care about their party environment. And over the course of the 8 weeks, they learn about sexual violence, they learn about gender roles, and they start to actually practice how you might systematically shape a party environment, right? Because party environments, just like any other environments, are shaped. The theme, for instance, is a great policy that is used to shape the tone of a party. The difference between a CEO's and sexy secretary's party and a Harry Potter party, and what you're sort of setting the groundwork for, is very, very different, right? And the policy that you have to have 3 women with you in order to get into a party versus one that doesn't have that policy has completely different intentions behind it, right? As far as what they're trying to set up in that space. And so this is a way, the groups are generally predominantly men, that we get men, women, people of all gender identities working together to try to have an impact on their party environment. And it is an example of how you create community around something that people care about, and then have that have an effect on shaping what's expected in those environments. The third example I'd give is it's called a Boys Restorative Program. It came out of the fact that there was a need to do particular programming for boys who were struggling in schools in Duluth. And so what we do here is we have groups for boys who throughout the elementary schools. There's about 100 who participate every year. And they actually come together, they learn to get close friendships together. We talk about the man box activity. That's a major, like one of the first things that they do is start talking about gender and how what expectations are related, also race and other forms of oppression. And then they take on projects of their own. The group is run by what the boys actually care about. But what we do is we point them towards taking leadership to have an impact on their school environment. So it's very much a weekly process in school, during school, building community amongst boys. And then the final example that'll pull from Men's Peacemakers is our Don't Buy It project. And you may have seen some things around town that relate to this. It's been supported heavily by the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, and it's been connected to the campaigns around the Super Bowl. But this is a project that focuses on getting men particularly involved in ending the demand for sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. And it's a great example. The reason I end with it is it sort of is a strategy that covers 3 different levels of engagement of men, shaping the norms around masculinity, and building community around those things as well. So I'm actually going to play a PSA video that helps describe the messaging.
Kids at school say sexting is normal, and if I don't do it, my boyfriend will break up with me. Don't buy it.
You hear all the time. Boys will be boys, and it's okay to use women. Don't buy it.
The media teaches us that our value lies in our bodies and how desirable we should be to men. Don't buy it. He told me he loved me, that I only have to strip for a little while and we'd start a new life together. Don't buy it.
Stripping and porn are harmless. It's not hurting anyone. So what's the big deal?
My daughter had to go to the ER 7 times while she was involved with porn because of the constant violence and trauma. It all started with the modeling ad.
I mean, she's 18. She's making her own decisions, right? I'm sure she likes it.
They changed my name. Threatened my family. I was thousands of miles away and sold for sex. Don't buy it.
The man who bought me said, "I thought we killed all you Indians." Prostitution is about power, control, and oppression. Don't buy it.
They tell you that there is no way out, that you're worthless, that no one wants damaged goods. Don't buy it.
Guys act like being a real man means dominating women, acting like you own them. Women are not products.
Children are not products.
People are not products. Men are more than consumers.
Okay, so there's more where that came from on the Don't Buy It Project website, and it's got a bunch more resources, and we'll have an online training around commercial sexual exploitation on there starting late next week, actually. But this strategy is sort of solidly rooted, especially around the Super Bowl, in raising awareness, right? And the awareness raising is on 2 levels. One is on shaping a conversation around something that's pretty normal in our communities, which is the commercial sexual exploitation and the sex trafficking, and getting that framed in a way where it's oppression, it's a form of oppression. The second part of it is to actually, the reason it's called the Don't Buy It Project is it's not really that literal around don't buy sex. We certainly mean that too, but it's also about don't buy into the man box stuff. Don't buy into the messages that tell you that women are primarily valuable for their bodies. Don't buy into the things that make it normal and possible to participate in commercial sexual exploitation. And so we're trying to reframe the way that men are thinking about their own positioning within commercial sexual exploitation as well. And then the thing that is going to happen next, after the Super Bowl happens, is we'll have a curriculum that's designed for community engagement, as well as a train-the-trainer module for that. So there's an opportunity to get community members engaged in ways that can be useful to the women and the advocates and the folks who are doing the work in the community. So building a community of folks who can actually help move it on. So I think I'm going to pause there, but I just want to close by saying that this was a short amount of time, and one thing that I'd like to say about Men as Peacemakers is that despite the fact that our name is Men as Peacemakers, and we care about engaging men with people of all gender identities, we're kind of split down the middle as far as identities are concerned, because we actually believe that that's where the power comes from, is in learning from one another as we create and do these things in community. And that, in fact, most of what we do is inspired and largely informed by the coalitions that exist here, folks like the Women's Foundation, and particularly folks like the Native Sisters Society in Duluth. Peng has been somebody who's role modeled and taught us how to do our work for long periods of time. So it's a great example of how a mainstream organization doesn't just thrive because mainstream or white men put together a bunch of projects that are supposed to help fix everything. It's really about building community and working together to learn how to help move the dial on this. Sorry, I took a little extra time there.
I wonder, do we have time for the video that I was going to show? Or should I just talk? Okay. Okay. I can show you where you can go find the video. On YouTube, there's actually a video that was commissioned by Asian United of Minnesota, which is actually the local domestic violence shelter for Asian women and the API community. And they asked one of our folks who was a part of Man Forward to actually create a spoken word piece. It's called Man Forward. If you go on YouTube, it's called Man Forward. So a lot of what we do, I wanted to share our strategy within Man Forward because we're so culturally specific to just the home community and engaging home men at this moment. We have a few Khmer folks and men in our group at this moment, but what I really wanted to zero in on is like building relationships, like all of the things that we were talking about, like Brian and Ed was talking about too, about like how do we talk about healthy masculinity in ways, but actually what does that really look like in practice, right? And what we do in Man Forward is we're building community with men. That's how we're engaging men, is we're building community with them and we're creating different practices. So that means that we're having different kinds of conversations with men and we're dialoguing and we're practicing. So what that really looks like on the ground is that when we meet, we're really talking about our relationships with ourselves. We're really talking about our relationships with our partners, our intimate partners. We're really talking about the relationships that we have with other people who are part of our lives. So we're checking in about those things and how those relationships are going, right? So it's not just like I'm doing good today and I'm fine and nothing is wrong with me, but man, this is what's happening in my life, right? What I tell often funders is that what you don't actually check on and what you don't count is the 10 o'clock phone calls that I get at night at 10 p.m. when a guy is so pissed off and he's so upset he doesn't know what to do, but the low-bearing fruit of violence is right there in the palm of his hand that he can actually choose to do that at any moment. But if he can actually talk to me or somebody within Man Forward, then at least it becomes a peer support space for him to walk through and to undo some of the things that he's thinking about, right? So the example that I'll give you there is that I had a call. The young man doesn't actually live here in Minnesota. I was providing support to him. He actually lives out in Philadelphia. And he said, with the whole Azid thing, any of you heard about that whole incident, right? And so he was like struggling with that because he was talking with his partner about that, and he was struggling with it because he was like, well, Azid didn't do anything legally wrong, right? And he was like, well, then what does that mean, right? What does that look like? Can men not have higher sex drives? Or he didn't say that, but can men not be horny, basically? And I said, that's not what we're talking about, is that when we only look at the definition of sexual violence through the legal lens, and the way in which we do accountability and the way in which we do justice is only through the legal lens, what we see is that if men don't behave in those ways that actually is against the law, then he didn't commit any harm, right? And this is a young man that gets gender equity. Like many of probably the men who are in this room who gets gender equity, wants to be good men. But he was struggling because he just couldn't understand why people had a problem with it, right? And so he's like, okay, I need to talk to somebody. And that's what we're doing, is trying to unlayer those, the onion with these men of like, you get gender equity, but what we're really talking about here is like really deep-seated stuff, because the socialization is so deep that it takes like 2-3 years or more. Like even doing this for 15 years, I learn every day. And I learn to undo sexism, homophobia, transphobia every single day that I'm walking and I'm breathing, and every morning that I wake up, and every night I go to bed. all of that washes away. Tomorrow morning I have to start over again. And then that's what that young man had picked up from the conversation and the training that I did. And he picked that up and he was like, I remember that, and so I had to make sure I was checking myself, right? Because privilege plays a lot into it. And so that's actually Man Forward strategy, is organizing, engaging men, building a community of men who can actually support each other and actually have good practices around what healthy masculinity really is. Because it's all great for us to be trained and to be taught to love, but we also have to know how to do it. And that's really our strategy, is knowing how to do it and how we're going to do it. So
I think what we'll move to now is questions and conversation and dialogue. So if the three presenters would come up here to answer your questions, and I'm going to ask Katie here to come around to you. If just please raise your hand. Who would like the microphone first? We'll come to you.
I don't have to be first. I just had a question close by. One question I had is, I feel like a lot of times men in men box, however you want to call it, traditional men, there's a you never hit a girl. There's that perception of you don't hit girls because girls are weak, or you need to protect girls, on one hand I'm like, great, and on the other hand I'm like, well, but aren't you, can you address that, like that attitude and how that plays into things? Do you know what I mean? I should ask
or maybe take a few questions?
Why don't we gather a couple of questions in the interest of time?
Well, I just had a specific question. So, data, and I'm sorry, I missed your name.
Yeah, Brian.
Brian. Well, it was on, I think, the second slide and another slide, your plot with masculinity versus, or behaviors about masculinity versus prevalence violence. Do you do any studies on the correlation between poverty and behaviors about masculinity? Did you do a multivariate analysis and control for poverty? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'll talk about it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I saw one up there.
Hello, my question is for the gentleman in the brown jacket. I'm sorry I forgot your name. I'm very interested in the Don't Buy It campaign, and so my question is, I know from my previous career in LGBTQ sexual health, that fear-based messaging does little, if anything, to induce positive behavior change among gay and bisexual men between the age of 18 and 25. Given that fact, can you explain to me how your organization settled on fear as a motivating factor behind Don't Buy It, the videos, rather than, say, empowerment or self-love?
Okay. So there's also a question here we can get to, but maybe we'll take three and then another round that gets these folks. Is that okay? So it was a real man doesn't use violence against a partner. It was correlations with wealth, and it was a specific question of Don't Buy It.
Who would like to start with the first question?
I think it's an intriguing message and something to add to, again, I was kind of urging us to carry some complexity. And maybe there are some people out there who would identify their identity as a man as someone who draws the line at using violence. But I think as you were continuing to explain what you meant by that notion, I still heard some tinges of, a man's autonomy over the bodies of women in his life, or like a man as a protector of the physical and bodily safety of women in his life. And I think that is still kind of crossing this messy boundary where, okay, the man isn't necessarily saying that he has complete agency and autonomy over using sexual violence against that person, but you still are kind of walking this line of man as protector, which means woman isn't able to protect. And then might even justify different forms of violence under the guise of protecting women. And even in a military sense, you can see all sorts of recruitment into military activity or wars fought throughout history with like posters and messaging based on a threat of violence against women of your identity and therefore a call to arms. And so there's just like a lot of messy violence even around the idea of a man as a protector that I'd love any other thoughts in the room to share. I don't want to dominate, I'm sorry, but because the question about correlations came specifically to me. Yeah, so the odds ratio and the multivariate regression results that I showed did account for wealth status in that arrangement. I think there's a lot we can talk about in terms of men's masculine identities related to income and their wealth level and the standard idea that a man needs to be a financial breadwinner, and what it means in a location where there are limited economic opportunities for men, that is another space. So often what we do is we have items in the survey about someone's level of stress related to their work situation. And we do see links about high levels of work-related stress or a fear that I'm not living up to, traditional manhood because I can't provide for my family in all these financial ways. And we see interesting dynamics there. But I'm pretty hesitant ever to use data to further stigmatize already stigmatized groups. And so I'm certainly resistant to ever say, look at those poor, backward, whatever people and how much more violence they use than others when we're talking about a society that's marginalized in the capitalist society and already stigmatized in a lot of other ways. So I sort of prefer not to tell the story that way and rather tell the story that even when we account for all of those other factors, the way we feel about gender still has a significant link in so many places.
Could you, interpret that differently and maybe say that if you're struggling with poverty, you have a very stressful life, and stress causes you to have.
Let's talk after. I think we can get to the questions. Thanks.
So I don't know if Ed or Pheng have anything to say about the first two questions before moving to the specific one related to divide.
The only thing that I'd add to the first question around sort of beliefs about never hitting women is that one of the more interesting activities that we sometimes do with young men, athletes, is where it's most common, is we have a series of what seem like really, really simple questions, like men should never hit a woman, or I believe that as a man I will never hit a woman. And we ask them to do one of those continuum activities or a raise the hand type thing where they tell us whether they agree or they disagree with that statement. And of course, as you were suggesting, it's one of those things where immediately all the hands go up in the air, right? Men are never supposed to hit women. So then what we do is we ask, okay, so you mean there's never any instance that you could think of ever at all possible where a man would hit a woman and that would be maybe something that could be justified? Like, we're not telling you how it is, we're just asking you to think a little bit deeper about it. And, once in a while somebody will sort of start rocking in their seat and saying, well, maybe if she had a gun, and my life was in danger, or somebody else's life was in danger, somebody else will say, well, maybe if the kids were like in harm's way, there'd be like enough force to de-escalate the situation. And a part of the purpose of the whole thing, it's part of a whole set of questions, but the purpose is to say, why? What are your values? What do you actually believe behind the idea that you never actually have a fist towards a woman? Like, what's the reason for that? What's the belief that you have, the value, the thing that you hold dear, that's going to help you make decisions in difficult circumstances, in easy circumstances, in circumstances where you're made, mad as heck. How are you going to be able to hold to those values? Because platitudes don't actually get us very far, especially when we're in a situation where we know that 1 in 3 women are experiencing that violence. So your question made me sort of reflect on that.
Do you want to speak to the don't buy it?
Yeah, sure. So I appreciate the question. One of the things there's a couple of things to say about the choice for how we frame the first part of the awareness raising campaign. The first piece of the equation is a little bit of what I was explaining about. Goal number 1 is to frame commercial sexual exploitation as a form of oppression, something that is causing causing consistent harm. Because that is not the normal frame that we've heard until very recently. And in fact, even just making the leap from sex trafficking as a form of harm to including all forms of commercial sexual exploitation as a form of harm and oppression is pretty new. So there's basically an attempt to be provocative to start a conversation about how that harm and how that oppression looks, and if people want to explore the nuances of what that looks like in commercial sexual exploitation, then we have a real opportunity to talk about what equity and safety and interconnected well-being and things that we are talking about valuing as a community together, how that would actually need to look in our community. So we're really trying to go to stage one where we're portraying and framing harm. The second part is that the target audience at this particular point is the folks that the research has suggested are the primary buyers. So it's predominantly middle-aged white men. That's who we're messaging to right now and trying to shape thinking around. It's been fed into and informed by a whole lot more than middle-aged white men, but that's where the messaging is targeted in particular. And as the project moves forward, like the next piece of messaging that's going to come out with the interactive online piece, it's titled "We Are All Connected," and it's an exploration of community interconnection and the way in which positive masculinity can play a role in addressing commercial sexual exploitation. So that's our thinking behind it. I think that there's probably strengths and weaknesses to it, but that's where we're at.
Okay, we're going to take 3 more questions from the audience, and for those that need to go at 6:30, feel free to do so, but we'll stick around a little longer for those that want to stay.
Hi. After listening to all your excellent examples of what men can do now to change the environment of violence against women, my question is, how can we reach that equilibrium of putting the voices of women and survivors in the center without taking the responsibility that men have in the issue?
So you talk a lot about violence as it's connected to masculinity, specifically domestic violence or murder or something like that. So my question is twofold. Is there a reason why it seems like there's a theme of focusing specifically on domestic violence as the main ways of trying to measure negative impacts of masculinity? And part of that, connected to that, is this idea of, have any of you ever looked outside of domestic violence to see these examples? Just recently in the media with school shootings, or in politics, or in gender and race in the media, sort of these other avenues, even in the military, these other avenues in which masculinity and violence intersect. What research have any of you done about that?
One from this side.
Hi, thanks for a riveting discussion. So coming from an educator of color's perspective, and speaking with my students, and in a more personal way with my parents especially, I guess dismantling these notions of masculinity that are very, very prevalent and framed in a way that's actually seen as normal in their culture, at least in my parents' culture. What sort of tools, or I guess what sort of approaches do you have, any of you, just breaking down barriers, which I find pretty difficult for me, talking to middle schoolers about masculinity and what's considered normal, when so much of their time is spent, trying to fit in with everybody else, or with my parents who gender violence is such a norm, even though they don't frame it as such. So, what sort of ideas or tips do you have?
Okay, so 3 questions. Who would like to start?
Yeah, and just like for my own memory. Question 1 was, how can we center the voices of survivors, work across all gender identities collaboratively in a sense of accountability on this? Masculinities and violence beyond domestic violence or beyond sexual harassment, and then like tips and strategies for breaking down some of the more restrictive norms. Okay. I mean, I can talk and talk.
Well, thank you. So I have a couple of thoughts, and it's random to those three things, but it'll hit some points of it. I think looking at our work on how do we center the voices of survivors and victims in the work it's so vitally important that we're always working alongside the women in our community. So like in Man Forward's work, we're not just working alone all the time. We may be out there visibly, things like that, but like our conversations and our partnerships are always with the women who've been doing this work in our community for a very long time, meaning Hmong women who've been doing this work for the last 30 years in the Hmong community around gender-based violence issues. And so that's what it looks like to us, is in constant relationship with those women who are doing this work, listening to their stories, listening to their leadership, following their leadership as well. So that's what it looks like to us in terms of the centering. When it's just the men who are having the conversation by themselves, it is really important then to really just have the men talk about their thoughts and their feelings only. And that if they start to segue or go into the direction of talking about the women in their lives and how those women are behaving, we try to reel them back oftentimes to come back and say, well, what did you do? How did you behave? What was happening on your end? So the focus is always on the men. And we learn that working with men who use violence in domestic violence groups and in sex offender groups as well, is to go back and focus on the men's behavior, their thoughts and their beliefs to where they got themselves. So then you don't bring up the conversations around women. Because once you start cracking that ice around women and girls and bringing them into the conversation, then that's when all of the other things happen, right? Where you start being violent towards women and girls. I think the part about like strategies is that it's just so vitally important that we know who we're talking to, because there's actually a lot of cultural nuances that we don't know that are happening in each particular community. And so we have to pay attention to what are those cultural nuances. So like when I talk to Hmong men, I don't say patriarchy, I don't say any of those things. I have to speak their language, I have to talk it in the way that they understand it. I have to understand their lived experiences and their relationship to the harm that's happening actually in the community. The violence happens in the context of living in the Hmong community, so therefore I have to talk about it in that way. The other part of it is that I think when we look at for men of color, is that because men of color are either, for Asian men, are either the nerds in the corner who know all the math things, or you're the martial arts expert. So you're not ever going to be man enough already, so that's the starting place, I think, oftentimes for men of color, is that you're not seen as men enough, and your masculinity is also not seen enough already in the society. So there's a lot of complexity, and I really appreciate Brian's point about the complexities that are involved in this. And so those are my points, is really just think about who you're talking with and how do you actually share these things in a way that they actually understand it, in the language that they understand it as well.
Okay. I'll go in reverse order and start with the tips and then go to the research directions and then come to the accountability question. Or I call it the accountability question. So a few ideas for you. The three that I kind of talk about quite a lot and think about if I'm designing a program, particularly if you mention middle schoolers. The first is that these norms are social norms, and so they're created socially. They're not just that individual middle schooler, like in his own mind or her own mind, invents this thing. And so one great strategy, of course, just to be aware of that. Social norm means as I interact in the world, I have expectations about what other people around are going to do and think, and I have expectations about what everyone else expects me to do and think. And so you kind of start to break those pieces, and so to create a sort of like not just an individual person, but a social conversation and a social setting that is challenging restrictive gender messages or other things is a crucial strategy. So to give that middle schooler an experience of not being alone, but being with a group that's reckoning with those ideas. That's one. Another one, for better or worse, particularly with the young students, a role model. If they can see someone who they look up to, maybe it's you, who exhibits a different style of a masculinity, and they can see that that person isn't ostracized, and that in fact they're actually pretty cool, and that maybe they would want to be like that person at some point. That's another tip to kind of like give a lived example. And a third would be that no one strategy is ever enough. That if you're doing the awareness thing, then you also got to be doing the classroom work, and you've also got to be shifting messages in media, and you've also got to be having some kind of campaign in the school, and you've also got to be having messages reinforced by parents, and there's just not a simple one-off solution that we can do. So, multifaceted approach, the social group that's deconstructing things, and a role model. I'm sorry for the question about limiting to domestic violence and sexual harassment, just that I think that was the nature of 15 minutes or less to cram everything in. But I mentioned it very, very briefly in one of my slides that tremendous links between adhering to a rigid sense of masculinity and self-harm, suicidal thoughts, depression, risky driving, alcohol use, traffic accidents, other kinds of delinquent criminal behavior, homicide. And depending on which country we go into and are conducting the surveys, there's different focuses. Most of my work is international, so we're going in locations of active conflict. We're fielding images in Afghanistan right now, so there's a whole array of questions in there about recruitment into militia groups, participation in the conflict, effect on that person's life of the conflict, and we're able to tie that with the gender norms, and so on. So we can talk afterward, and I can kind of point you in the direction if you want, but I think that was more just a function of the limited time of the presentation. I'm sorry, we passed 6:30. But this is maybe the most important one. No offense in the others, but like we're here at a. To be honest, like we're here as the Masculinities presentation, and we're at a moment where this idea of like there's a field and there's international conferences of quote unquote engaging men and boys toward gender equality and toward preventing violence, and I think the field is coming to really a moment of reckoning with that, and like, hold on, are we sometimes maybe being a little bit dangerous or being even like patriarchal about how we're dismantling patriarchy? And there's a conversation really happening, particularly in the international space, which is like, hold up, donors, how much money is going to organizations that are led by men and are all about bringing groups of men together, and like, as compared to the funding for vital crisis services and support services for survivors of violence and those kind of things. And that conversation is really active, it's really important. It's incumbent on those of us of our gender identity and the work that we're doing to make that a part of the conversation and to be open and vulnerable about it. And if I'm speaking personally, I'm motivated to be working toward, throughout my career of working on violence prevention that centers deconstructing masculinities, to wind up many years down the road where the idea that there needs to be like a men's group in that corner and a women's group in that corner and never the twain shall meet isn't what it looks like anymore. Because that's not how we live in society. We live in relationship with one another. And so we're all kind of trying to do our best. The idea that intimate partner violence is even a bad thing is in mainstream society, or at least what like nonprofit donors will fund you to do, is actually like 20 or 30 years old, so we haven't had a whole lot of time to come to the most transcendent, unified, accountable, rigorous, ethical methodologies, but I think we're getting there. And I'm inspired by methodologies and approaches that kind of throw the men in one corner, women in the other out and are just interacting with the community as it is and having everybody talk about it openly. So we can continue to talk about that. I'm sorry.
Ed, for a last word in terms of answers to these questions, and then we'll close it up.
Well, I appreciate the answers that Pheng and Brian have shared. I think that I would just reiterate, sort of the order that hasn't been talked this, in our society, if we're going to focus on our country, the white men in particular, cisgendered white men, have made a great deal of money on black people's bodies, the land of Native people, and then women's bodies. And you can see that line go through the entire history of the country. And so when you talk about places that we see this stuff show up externally, I think you can look anywhere from the effects of police brutality and the effects that has on black men, on men of color, on Native men, and then what effect does that have on women in those communities? How does that affect the way that there's support for the violence that they face, whether it's sexual violence, whether it's childhood perpetration, whether it's domestic violence? That's part of the reason why, to piggyback off of what Brian is saying, the importance of the idea that this isn't about which group can come up with the best solutions. It's about how we build community in a way that is reflective of the reality that we're living in, and is able to try to practice first and foremost, and then address that reality. And that means that it's beyond just talking about the man box and just talking about gender roles. It is about talking about how we value our interconnected well-being together. And if we can normalize the way that men, along with women and people of all gender identities, are talking about that and are practicing that and are learning about their gender roles and the sort of line of goods that they've been sold about who they are as men, and how that contradicts with the way that people are experiencing violence and oppression and harm in the society, it moves us to the place that we need to go. And just lots of respect for that question, because it's useful to have a space once in a while where you hear from folks who are identified as men talking about this stuff. But the reality of the equation is that one of the things I bring to the table is I know what it's like. When Brian first met me, he used to be my RA, by the way. I was completely adhered to that man box because I had been socialized as a small town kid who was really good at sports. Like athletics was my main thing. Like I know what it's like to be in that space. I don't know what it feels like to be afraid of police officers. I don't know what it feels like to be worried about what it's going to be like to walk from that one party to the next party, et cetera, et cetera. And it's these collective understandings of the reality that we're in, and the leadership of the folks who are experiencing the most harm that's going to get us where we need to be.
So with that, I think that was a great closing to our program for tonight. Thank you to each one of our speakers for some stimulating presentations, some good dialogue. I wish we had some more time for dialogue with the audience, but feel free to stay around here or in the atrium to talk and converse afterwards. And thank you for coming.